It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, like any other, in the bustling corporate office where employees hustled through their routines, eyes glued to computer screens, and the sound of clicking keyboards filled the air. The building, sleek and modern, was a symbol of power and success, and the people within it mirrored that same ambition. But in the midst of all the buzz, one person went unnoticed: Mary, the janitor. For years, she had been the quiet presence behind the scenes, cleaning floors, scrubbing windows, and maintaining the pristine environment the office demanded. Dressed in her standard janitorial uniform, Mary walked down the hallway with a quiet dignity, her worn shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. Her face was a map of stories untold, etched with the wear and tear of a life that had both humbled and strengthened her. She wasn't a stranger to the office, but she wasn't a part of it either. Every day, she was a ghost, moving in and out of spaces where she was invisible, her only purpose to make sure everything was spotless. The workers hardly noticed her, let alone spoke to her. To them, she was just the woman who cleaned the restrooms and took out the trash. They smiled politely when they crossed paths, but those smiles never reached beyond the surface. It wasn't cruelty, they simply didn't see her. Not as a person, not as someone worthy of their attention. She had learned to accept this over time, her world becoming smaller with each passing year. Today, however, something felt different. There was a strange tension in the air, an undercurrent that was barely noticeable but present all the same. The office was busier than usual, employees scurrying to meetings and making phone calls in hushed tones. Mary noticed this as she pushed her cleaning cart down the hall. The office was abuzz with the usual frantic energy, but there was something beneath it, a palpable sense of anticipation. As she moved closer to the boss's office, Mary caught snippets of conversation. "Did you hear who's coming in today?" one voice said, too faint to make out the details. "This is going to change everything," another whispered, as though something monumental was about to happen. She frowned, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't like her to get involved in office gossip, but the tension in the air made her curious. She wasn't used to being part of any conversations. She knew the names of a few employees, those who were polite enough to acknowledge her existence, but their conversations were never about her. She pushed open the door to the boss's office, a room that felt like it belonged to a world far beyond her reach. It was immaculate, filled with sleek, modern furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city skyline. The view from here always made her feel small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But today, the office seemed more distant than ever. Mary set to work, methodically dusting the furniture and straightening the papers on Mr. Thompson's desk. The noise from the rest of the office faded as she focused on her task, her hands moving instinctively, years of experience guiding her. She heard voices from the hallway, employees laughing, gossiping, but none of it mattered to her. She had a job to do, and she did it well. As she worked, a group of employees entered the room. They were laughing, clearly unaware of her presence as they walked past her, one by one. They continued their conversation as if she wasn't even there. They made jokes, comments about the office renovations, and a few cracks about the latest company policy. Nothing unusual, except for the way they looked at her. Mary felt it, their eyes were dismissive, like she didn't belong in this space. It was a feeling she had gotten used to over the years. She didn't mind it, after all, this was her place. She wasn't meant to stand out or take up space. Her role was to blend into the background. But today, as they passed by, one of them, Terry, the office manager, snickered as she caught sight of Mary. "Hey, Mary," Terry called out, a playful smile on his face. "Don't forget to clean up the boss's desk, too. He's a bit of a neat freak." The others laughed, and for a moment, Mary felt the sting of their mockery. It wasn't that they meant any harm, but it was the same old routine, the same old jokes. She had come to expect it, but it still hurt. She forced a smile, nodding politely, and returned to her task. She didn't let it bother her. she couldn't afford to. Then, without warning, something unusual happened. Mr. Thompson, the boss, stepped into the room. He was a tall man, always impeccably dressed, his sharp suit and polished shoes reflecting his success. He was the epitome of power in the office, and everyone knew it. His presence commanded attention, even from the most hardened of employees. "Mary," he said, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs in the room, "could you step inside for a moment? I need to speak with you." For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The laughter in the office faltered, replaced by an eerie silence. Employees glanced at each other, surprised and unsure of what was happening. Mary's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't normal. No janitor was ever called into the boss's office for anything other than to clean up a spill or fix a broken light bulb. But Mr. Thompson's expression was serious, and the others fell silent. Terry, who had been laughing just moments before, shot a glance at Mary. "Looks like the boss has a special request for you," he said with a smirk, clearly amused. Mary swallowed hard. She wasn't sure what to do. Should she accept the invitation or decline? The thought of stepping into Mr. Thompson's office, facing a room full of people who saw her as little more than a background figure, made her stomach twist. But there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, she straightened her back, pushed her cart to the side, and walked into the boss's office. The door closed behind her, and for a moment, she felt like an outsider. The room felt even more sterile than usual, and the silence was oppressive. Mr. Thompson was standing by the window, his back turned to her as he gazed out over the city. For a moment, he didn't speak. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the entire office was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Mary," he finally said, his tone unexpectedly soft. "I've been watching you for a while now." Mary's heart skipped a beat. Watching her? But why? She didn't say anything, unsure of how to respond. Her hands were clammy, her mind racing with possibilities. Was she in trouble? Had someone complained about her work? "I know you've been here for a long time," Mr. Thompson continued, turning to face her. "And I have to admit, I don't think I've ever really gotten to know you. Not like I should have." Mary blinked, surprised. The boss knew her name? This was the first time he'd ever addressed her directly. I just do my job," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense to him. "That's just it, Mary," he said, stepping closer. "You do your job better than most of the people in this office. You're always here, always on time, never complaining. But you're invisible to everyone else." Mary felt a lump form in her throat. The weight of his words hung heavily in the room. She had always known she was invisible to the office. But hearing it from him, someone she had never even spoken to before, was different. It was like her existence was being acknowledged, but in a way that was more painful than anything else. "I need you to do something for me," he said, his gaze steady and serious. "There's a new initiative we're rolling out, and I need your input." Mary's head spun. Her input? Why would the boss want the opinion of someone like her, someone who scrubbed the toilets and swept the floors? But before she could say anything, Mr. Thompson continued. "Don't worry, I'm not asking you to do anything outside of your job. I want you to speak your mind. Tell me what you think of the direction we're going in." Her mind raced, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a surge of something, a spark of hope, maybe. This wasn't what she had expected, but maybe, just maybe, it was the chance she had been waiting for. Mary stood there for a long moment, unsure how to respond. The request felt surreal, out of place in the very space that had long symbolized the divide between her world and that of the people who worked in the office. The room was still, the only sound the hum of the air conditioning. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt her heart race, not from fear, but from something else. Something new. Something unfamiliar. "You want my input?" she asked cautiously, almost to herself. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, as though she wasn't entirely sure of the words coming out of her mouth. I'm just the janitor." Mr. Thompson's gaze softened, and he gave a small, knowing smile. "I know what you do, Mary. But I also know that you see things that the rest of us don't. You're in and out of every office, you hear conversations, you notice details no one else pays attention to. You have a perspective that no one else in this building has." Mary felt her heart race again. Was he serious? This wasn't how things worked. She was just there to clean. She wasn't supposed to be part of any major decisions, let alone give advice on corporate initiatives. She looked down at her hands, unsure how to process the unexpected turn of events. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She had spent so many years in the background that the idea of being seen was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I'm not sure I can help with anything, sir," Mary said, her voice quieter this time. "I'm just a janitor. I don't know about your initiatives or business plans." But Mr. Thompson wasn't discouraged. He stepped closer, his presence filling the room in a way that made her feel even more out of place. "I'm not asking you to be a business expert, Mary," he said, his voice steady and firm. "I'm asking you to be honest. I'm asking you to speak your truth. The people in this office, they're all too focused on their own agendas. Too busy climbing the corporate ladder. But you? You see the little things. The things they overlook. You understand what really matters." Mary shook her head, not fully grasping what he was saying. Was he really asking for her opinion? What could someone like her possibly offer? But then, a strange thought crept into her mind, maybe he was right. Maybe she had seen things others hadn't. She had spent years watching, listening, observing the dynamics between employees, noticing the subtle ways people interacted. She knew more about the office than anyone realized, but it was hard to imagine how any of it would be of value to someone like Mr. Thompson. "You want me to speak my mind," she repeated slowly, as if trying to grasp the enormity of what he was asking. "About what?" "I want to know what you think of this place," Mr. Thompson said, leaning against the desk, his arms crossed. "What's wrong with the way things are run? What's missing? What do we overlook? What do you see that no one else does?" The silence between them stretched on. Mary's mind was racing. She had always been so careful to stay invisible, to stay out of the way. It had been a survival tactic. If she didn't stand out, if she didn't draw attention to herself, she wouldn't be a target for ridicule or criticism. But now, here she was, being asked to speak up, to break out of the mold she had so carefully constructed for herself. "Well," she began hesitantly, unsure of where to start, "I see how the employees are always rushing around, focused on their work. They don't have time to look at each other, to really see each other. They're so focused on their own success, they forget about the people around them. I've seen it happen over and over. People get so caught up in their own ambitions that they forget what it means to work together." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, as if he were taking in every word she said. "Go on." Mary felt a strange sense of relief wash over her as she spoke. It was almost as if the words were tumbling out before she had a chance to stop them. "I see how the people at the top, the managers, the executives, they're so disconnected from the rest of the office. They don't even know the names of the people who work for them. They don't see the sacrifices we make. I've overheard conversations, in the break rooms and the hallways. Some of them don't even realize that their actions have consequences on the rest of us." She paused, looking down at her hands, trying to steady her breath. This was the most she had said in a long time, the most she had ever shared about how she saw the office. She felt a sense of vulnerability that she wasn't used to. But something about Mr. Thompson's calm demeanor made her feel like he was listening, really listening. And that was something she hadn't experienced in a long time. I've also noticed that no one ever really talks to the people who do the behind-the-scenes work, she continued, her voice growing a little stronger. No one asks how we're doing. No one thanks us. We're invisible to them, and they don't even realize it. The office would fall apart if people like me didn't do our jobs, but we're treated like we don't matter. Mr. Thompson's eyes softened, and he took a deep breath. You're right, he said quietly. I've been guilty of that myself. We've all been guilty of overlooking the people who keep this place running. Mary felt a pang in her chest. He was the boss. He had power. And yet, he was admitting that he had made the same mistake that so many others had. She didn't know if she was relieved or frustrated. It was a mix of emotions she couldn't quite put into words. I'm not asking for special treatment, she said, her voice quieter now. I just want to be seen. I want the people who work here to realize that we all matter. Everyone contributes in some way. But it feels like only the people in the corner offices get recognition. Mr. Thompson was silent for a long time, his expression thoughtful. Then, he finally spoke. You've given me a lot to think about, Mary. Maybe it's time we start looking at things differently. Maybe it's time we start seeing people for who they really are, not just for the roles they play. Mary swallowed hard. She didn't know what this meant for her future in the office, but it felt like something important had just shifted. She wasn't sure how things would change, but in that moment, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to be the way they had always been. Maybe the world could change, starting with just one conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to listen, she said softly, her eyes meeting his. I didn't expect this. Mr. Thompson gave her a small, almost apologetic smile. I didn't expect it either, but I'm glad you spoke up. You've given me a lot to think about. For the first time in her life, Mary felt like she had made an impact. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was a start. A tiny crack in the surface of the office's carefully constructed facade. And in that moment, she realized that sometimes, the most powerful voices were the ones that had been silenced for so long. As she left Mr. Thompson's office, she felt a strange weight lift from her shoulders. It was as if, for the first time in her life, she had been seen, not just as a janitor, not just as someone who cleaned up after others, but as a person with value, with something to offer. And though she didn't know what would happen next, she knew that this conversation had changed something inside of her. The office buzzed with energy as she returned to her cart, the world around her unaware of the momentous shift that had just taken place. But she knew. She had spoken her truth. And that was something that no one could ever take away from her. The morning after their conversation, things seemed to settle back into the familiar rhythm of the office. Mary, like always, slipped into her routine, sweeping floors, cleaning windows, wiping down counters. Yet, a subtle change had begun to settle within her, a quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible anymore. As she moved through the halls, she noticed the way the employees looked at her. Some of them didn't notice her at all, their heads buried in their phones or papers, too absorbed in their own worlds. Others, though, their gazes lingered for a second longer than usual. Was it just her imagination? Or had something shifted? As the days passed, she found herself walking a little taller, her steps a little more purposeful. Her mind, once clouded with self-doubt and the weight of years spent in the background, felt clearer. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was a change that resonated deep within her. She began to find herself thinking more critically about the people around her, their actions, their words, and how their lives intersected with hers. She realized she had been so focused on doing her job that she had forgotten how much power the small interactions between people held. One afternoon, as she was cleaning up the break room, she overheard a conversation between a few of the junior managers. They were talking about an upcoming project, something that could have a significant impact on the company's bottom line. Mary, as always, had a knack for overhearing things. She had become adept at absorbing information without ever being noticed. But this time, something about their conversation caught her attention. They were discussing an idea that sounded eerily familiar. It was something that had been pitched by one of the employees in the office months ago, but it had been dismissed almost immediately, laughed off as impractical and unrealistic. Now, it was being reworked, with a few adjustments, and suddenly, it was the hot new idea that everyone was excited about. Mary's brow furrowed. She had never liked office politics. The way people in power could manipulate situations, take credit for others' ideas, and disregard those at the bottom, she had seen it too many times. But this? This felt different. It felt wrong. She had to speak up. She wasn't sure how or when, but she knew it was time. That afternoon, when she was taking her break, she saw Mr. Thompson walking down the hallway. He was in a hurry, as usual, but he made eye contact with her and offered a polite smile. Mary hesitated for a moment, but then, before she could second-guess herself, she found herself walking toward him. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, her voice steady despite the nerves swirling in her stomach. He turned, his expression curious. "Mary, right? Is everything okay?" "I overheard something," she said, feeling the weight of her words as she spoke them. "It's about the new project the team's working on. I think you need to know something." He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What is it?" "I've been here long enough to know when something doesn't sit right," she began, her words coming out slowly, but with increasing certainty. "That idea they're pushing, well, it's not their idea. It was someone else's. Someone else who doesn't have a voice in this office. Someone who's been ignored." Mr. Thompson paused, his brow furrowing. "Are you sure?" Mary nodded. "I overheard them talking. It's been repackaged, but it's the same idea from a few months ago." For a long moment, Mr. Thompson said nothing. His gaze shifted away from her, as if he were processing the information, weighing it against the image he had of his team. Mary wasn't sure if he would believe her or dismiss her as just another janitor with no real understanding of the inner workings of the office. But when he spoke, his voice was serious, far more serious than she had expected. "I'll look into it," he said quietly. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Mary. I appreciate it." Her heart raced, a mix of disbelief and relief flooding through her. Had she just made a difference? Had she really spoken up in a way that mattered? She didn't know for sure, but she knew one thing for certain: she had taken a step forward, out of the shadows and into a space where her voice was heard, if only for a moment. The next few days felt strange. Mary continued with her work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing behind the scenes. The employees in the office, especially the junior managers, seemed a little more tense, a little more on edge. She overheard snippets of conversations in the break room, people whispering, their voices tinged with suspicion. What had she started? She wasn't sure, but the fact that she had taken the risk to speak up, to challenge the status quo, seemed to have sparked a chain reaction she couldn't fully comprehend. And then, one morning, as she was cleaning the floor near the elevators, she saw it. Mr. Thompson was standing by the coffee machine, deep in conversation with one of the junior managers. Their exchange was quiet, but Mary could catch a few words. "Investigate the source," she heard him say. "Make sure we're not overlooking anyone." She didn't catch the rest, but the tone in his voice was enough to confirm that he was taking her concerns seriously. The following week, an unexpected meeting was called. All employees were required to attend, including the janitorial staff. It was rare for people like her to be included in company-wide meetings, but the invitation was extended nonetheless. Mary felt her stomach flip. What was going on? Why was she being asked to attend? The meeting room was full, the air thick with anticipation. Mary, standing in the back with a few of the other janitors, felt a nervous flutter in her chest. Mr. Thompson walked into the room, his presence commanding attention as always. He stepped to the front, where a projector screen displayed a slideshow of the company's latest project. "Thank you for joining me," he began, his voice steady. "I wanted to address something important today. It has come to my attention that some of our recent ideas have been reworked and presented without giving credit where it's due." Mary's heart skipped a beat. He was talking about the project. He was talking about the idea she had spoken up about. "I've made a commitment to change the way we do things here," Mr. Thompson continued. "We will be recognizing the contributions of everyone in this office, regardless of their position. If you have an idea, if you have a voice, you deserve to be heard." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling in. Mary could feel the eyes of her coworkers on her. Some were confused, some were shocked, and others looked downright uncomfortable. But Mary couldn't help the smile that tugged at the corners of her lips. She had done it. She had spoken out, and it had made a difference. As the meeting ended and everyone began to file out, Mary stayed behind for a moment, her mind racing. She had taken a risk, spoken out, and in return, she had been given a voice that had been ignored for far too long. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt like she had the power to change something, no matter how small. As she walked back to her cart, she couldn't help but wonder, was this just the beginning? The weeks following the meeting felt like a whirlwind. Mary's life, once simple and routine, had become a series of unexpected events, each one challenging the norms she had long accepted. Every day, she walked through the office with a growing sense of purpose, a quiet awareness that she was now part of something bigger than herself. The changes that had started with her decision to speak up were now rippling through the company, but little did she know, the fallout from those changes would have consequences far beyond the walls of her workplace. Mr. Thompson's words had been a catalyst. People were talking, whispering in hallways, gathering in small groups during breaks. The dynamics in the office had shifted. There was a new sense of accountability in the air, a subtle but undeniable tension. The once unspoken hierarchy had begun to show cracks, and people were starting to question everything from management decisions to their own roles within the company. Mary couldn't help but notice the way the executives began to treat her differently. There was a polite nod here, a courteous greeting there, nothing overt, but enough to make her feel the change. Still, it wasn't all smooth sailing. As Mary grew more confident in her ability to stand her ground, others, especially the junior managers, grew resentful. One afternoon, as Mary was working on the top floor, cleaning up after a catered lunch, she overheard two managers talking. Their voices were low, but the frustration in their tone was palpable. "What's going on with him?" one of them muttered. "Ever since that meeting, he's been on this everyone's equal kick. Now we've got the janitors in the room during meetings. What's next? Are we going to start asking the security guards for their opinions?" Mary's heart sank. She could hear the mockery in their voices, the disdain for what had changed. It stung more than she expected. She had hoped for understanding, for support, but instead, she was witnessing the birth of a backlash. The higher-ups may have made promises of inclusivity and respect, but the road to true change was a difficult one, and it was clear that not everyone was on board. The resentment was palpable, and Mary felt it seeping into every corner of the office. As the weeks went by, things began to unravel. The once friendly atmosphere of the office had given way to suspicion. Employees who had never been close were now keeping their distance, and the team that had once worked seamlessly together was now fractured. The junior managers, who had once been the face of the company's innovation and progress, were now openly challenging the changes. They felt threatened by the new sense of egalitarianism that Mr. Thompson had started to promote, and they were afraid of losing their influence. One day, Mary was in the break room, silently sipping her coffee, when she overheard a conversation that stopped her cold. It was between two junior managers, Brad and Sarah. And the words that followed made her stomach churn. "He's lost it," Brad said, his voice full of frustration. "This whole democratic approach is just nonsense. We're supposed to be running a business here, not a daycare. And if he keeps pushing this, we might need to have a serious talk about our future here." Sarah's response was more measured, but it was clear she was equally concerned. "I don't know, Brad. He's been making some changes that I didn't expect. The way he's talking, it's like everyone's got a voice now. We can't just let anyone walk in here and start questioning things. We have to keep control." The conversation lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken threats. Mary knew exactly what they were implying. The moment she had stepped up and spoken her truth, it had set off a chain reaction that was now pushing back on the very changes that had empowered her. She wasn't naive, she understood that change wasn't easy, especially in a corporate world built on power and control. But hearing their words made her realize just how deeply the roots of inequality and resentment ran. The office wasn't just a workplace, it was a battleground, and the fight for power was far from over. Despite the growing resistance, Mary continued to carry herself with newfound confidence. She refused to let the negativity get to her. Every day, as she swept the floors, wiped down the desks, and cleaned the windows, she felt a quiet strength building within her. She wasn't just a janitor anymore. She was a part of the conversation, a force in a place where she had once been invisible. But even as she embraced this new identity, she couldn't ignore the growing tension. It all came to a head one afternoon when Mary was asked to attend another meeting. This time, however, things felt different. Mr. Thompson, who had once been an advocate for her, seemed distracted. He was no longer the open, engaged leader who had once listened to her concerns with genuine interest. The atmosphere in the room was thick with unease, and it was clear that the changes he had introduced were beginning to take their toll. As Mary sat there, quietly observing, she saw the tension in the faces of the employees around her. Some were looking at her with something akin to resentment, as if her presence was a reminder of a change they hadn't signed up for. Mr. Thompson began the meeting with a strange air of hesitation. He spoke about progress, about making sure everyone's voice was heard, but his words seemed hollow, as though they had lost their meaning. The once vibrant atmosphere of innovation and openness was now suffocated by an undercurrent of fear and uncertainty. The junior managers, who had once been eager to climb the corporate ladder, now seemed to be pulling back, playing their cards closer to their chests. The employees who had once trusted Mr. Thompson's leadership were now questioning him, and the shift in the office culture was becoming undeniable. It was during this meeting that Mary realized something important. She had become a symbol, whether she liked it or not, of the changes happening in the office. But her presence, her voice, was no longer enough to sustain that change. The problem was much deeper than a few resentful managers or a handful of disgruntled employees. It was about the fundamental structure of power and authority, the way it had been built up over the years. And no matter how much Mary, or Mr. Thompson, tried to change the dynamic, there was something ingrained in the system that resisted change at its core. As the meeting came to an end, Mr. Thompson turned to Mary with a weary smile. "Thanks for your input today, Mary," he said quietly, his voice lacking the enthusiasm it once had. "We'll see what we can do." But the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He was tired. He had fought hard to create an inclusive office culture, but he was beginning to understand just how entrenched the old ways were. The system, the people in power, the culture, everything was working against the changes he had hoped to create. The fallout was swift and brutal. Over the next few days, rumors spread through the office like wildfire. The junior managers, who had once been so vocal in their support of Mr. Thompson's vision, were now starting to distance themselves from the changes. They began to undermine his leadership, spreading whispers of discontent and quietly working behind his back to push for a return to the old ways. They couldn't just accept the change, couldn't embrace the idea of a more democratic, inclusive workplace. The balance of power had shifted, and they were losing their grip. For Mary, the realization was sobering. She had fought for her voice, for recognition, but the battle was far from over. The office, it seemed, was stuck in a perpetual cycle of resistance, unwilling to fully embrace the change that had been set in motion. She had hoped that by speaking up, by challenging the status quo, she could make a difference. And while she had, in some ways, succeeded in opening a door to greater accountability and transparency, the road to true equality was still long and uncertain. As the days turned into weeks, Mary continued to do her job with the same quiet determination. She had learned an important lesson, that true change was not always immediate, and sometimes, even the most well-intentioned efforts were met with resistance. But that didn't mean she would stop fighting for what she believed in. The office was still a place of tension, but it was also a place where change could happen, even if it took time. And Mary knew, deep down, that as long as she held on to her voice, she would continue to be a part of the fight for a more equitable future. In the weeks following the meeting, the atmosphere in the office became increasingly volatile. The ripple effect of Mary's bold move was still felt throughout the company, but the transformation was far from what she had expected. Despite the initial support from Mr. Thompson, the corporate culture was pushing back in ways she hadn't anticipated. As the days passed, the offices seemed to hold their breath, each employee now acutely aware of the tectonic shifts that had started to break apart the long-standing norms. Yet, despite all of this, Mary knew she had no choice but to keep moving forward. Her resolve was tested every single day. The once friendly smiles from her co-workers had become more strained, their greetings colder, almost patronizing. People who had once ignored her now acknowledged her presence with a forced nod, as if they were waiting for her to slip up, waiting for her to become the problem again. The junior managers, especially Brad and Sarah, had intensified their campaign against the changes. They began to work behind the scenes to sabotage the positive momentum that Mr. Thompson had tried to build. They spoke to the employees privately, planting seeds of doubt and fear. "Do you really think things are better?" Brad would say, his voice low. "We're all just going to be caught up in some endless cycle of inclusivity until the whole thing collapses. You'll see. This is a business, not a playground." The office dynamics were shifting, and Mary began to realize that the backlash was not just against the idea of change, but against her, the symbol of that change. She had once been invisible, a janitor, but now she was something else entirely. To some, she was a hero, a representative of the underdog rising to the occasion. To others, she was a threat, a reminder of how fragile the power structures were. The moment she opened her mouth that day in the meeting, she had shifted the balance, but at what cost? The weeks felt longer as Mary navigated through this newly charged atmosphere. Every moment was a reminder that true change was rarely simple. She had stepped into a role she wasn't prepared for, and yet, she couldn't retreat. One day, while cleaning the executive offices, she overheard a conversation between two senior managers. It was meant to be private, but Mary couldn't help but catch snippets of it as she passed the door. "We're losing control," one of them said, his voice tight with frustration. "The whole company's going to fall apart if this keeps up. Mr. Thompson's gone soft. We need to put things back in order." The other manager, his tone even colder, responded with a quiet but chilling assertion, "You know what to do." Mary's heart pounded in her chest as she recognized the undertone of what she was hearing. They were conspiring. There was no question now, they were going to do everything they could to reverse the changes Mr. Thompson had implemented, and Mary would be caught in the crossfire. The next day, as she was cleaning up the kitchen, Brad approached her. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by something more calculated. "You've made your point, Mary," he said, his voice almost friendly. "But you have to understand, things don't work here the way you think they do. This office, this company, has been built on structure, on hierarchy. You can't just disrupt that and expect everything to be fine. Mary stood still, wiping down the counter, but her mind was racing. I'm not trying to disrupt anything, she replied calmly. I'm just trying to make things better for everyone. Brad's smile faded. That's the problem. You think you're doing the right thing, but you're playing with fire. Do you think they'll let you get away with this? The higher-ups? They're going to shut it all down. And you'll be the one left holding the bag. It wasn't just an idle threat. It was a clear warning, one that made her question everything. What would she do if the very changes she had fought for were taken away from her? What if the system, the very people she had believed could make a difference, turned against her? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but the one thing she knew for sure was that she couldn't back down now. She had seen the cracks, had felt the shift, and she wasn't going to let it all slip away without a fight. The tension reached a boiling point when the company's quarterly meeting came around. This was the one time of the year when all the executives gathered to discuss the future of the company, its growth, and its strategy. Everyone, from the highest to the lowest employee, was invited to sit in and listen. It was supposed to be a time for collaboration, for shared vision. But this year, it felt different. Mary, who had been invited by Mr. Thompson to attend, walked into the meeting room feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on her. As the meeting started, the room was filled with tension, each person wary of the other. Mr. Thompson began by introducing the new initiatives he had been working on, initiatives that were supposed to bring about more inclusivity, more opportunities for all employees, regardless of their position. But as he spoke, it became clear that not everyone was on board with the changes. There were subtle glances exchanged between the junior managers, hushed whispers among the senior staff. They were circling, biding their time, waiting for their moment. And then, it came. A senior manager named Victoria stood up. Her voice was firm and confident as she addressed the room. With all due respect, Mr. Thompson, the changes you've been pushing are not only unnecessary, they're unsustainable. This company was built on a foundation of respect for hierarchy. We've had systems in place for a reason. Opening the doors to everyone, regardless of their position, dilutes that respect. It threatens the very structure that has kept us running smoothly all these years. Mary's heart sank as she realized the shift was no longer subtle. The backlash had become open warfare. The executives, the ones who had once seemed like allies, were now standing up against the very vision that had been set in motion. And in the midst of it all, she was expected to stay silent. But she couldn't. With every ounce of courage she had left, Mary stood up. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her as she slowly made her way to the front. She wasn't just a janitor anymore. She was part of this story. I've worked here for years, she began, her voice steady but strong. I've seen what it's like to be invisible. To be dismissed. But I've also seen what happens when people are given a chance to contribute, to be heard. The changes Mr. Thompson has made may be difficult, but they're necessary. This company won't thrive if we only respect power and hierarchy. We have to respect people. All people. Her words hung in the air, the silence thick with uncertainty. The resistance was palpable, but something had shifted. Mary's words had landed, not just on the executives, but on every person in that room. Even those who disagreed with her couldn't deny that there was something undeniable about the strength in her conviction. The very thing that had once made her invisible had now made her unstoppable. The room was still silent, but Mary knew one thing for sure, the battle was far from over. She had set the wheels in motion, and whether the company liked it or not, change was coming. But as she left that meeting, she also understood that the road ahead would be filled with obstacles. The backlash would continue, and the fight for equality, for respect, would be long and hard. But she was ready. She had started something important, something that couldn't be erased. And she would see it through, no matter the cost. The weeks that followed Mary's confrontation at the quarterly meeting were a whirlwind. The corporate office, once a place of routine and predictability, had become a battlefield. The initial shock of her words seemed to settle like dust, but the tension remained palpable, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Employees who had once been content to follow the status quo now found themselves questioning everything. It was as though a light had been flicked on, revealing the cracks in the company's facade. Those who were brave enough to speak up found themselves caught in a struggle that was far larger than just a single issue. The very nature of power, respect, and authority had been called into question, and some weren't ready for the consequences. The management's response was swift and calculated. They couldn't afford to appear weak, nor could they let the ground shift beneath them. Victoria, the senior manager who had openly opposed Mr. Thompson's initiatives, began rallying the senior staff against what she deemed as a misguided attempt to change the fabric of the company. Behind closed doors, she gathered her allies, those who felt threatened by the changes and the growing push for inclusivity. Together, they started to strategize on how to undermine Mr. Thompson's efforts without openly defying him. It was a delicate dance. They needed to maintain their positions of power while at the same time, dismantling the changes that had begun to take root in the company. Mary, however, was not one to back down. She wasn't naive enough to think that her words had solved everything, but they had cracked the door open. She had given voice to those who had felt silenced for so long. And for the first time in a long while, people were paying attention. In the days following her speech, several employees from different departments started approaching her. Some with gratitude, others with a sense of shared guilt, acknowledging that they too had been complicit in the culture of silence that had prevailed for so long. Mary had become a symbol, a beacon of defiance in a company that had once been governed by unspoken rules and expectations. But the road ahead was anything but easy. Each day, the pressure mounted. The upper management tried to carry on as though nothing had happened, hoping the storm would pass. But Mary knew that wasn't an option. Every time she walked through the hallways, she could feel the eyes on her. Some were full of judgment, others of curiosity. It was as if she had become both a hero and a target. The whispers had started again, but this time, they weren't about her role as a janitor. They were about the stand she had taken, and whether or not she was strong enough to see it through. One afternoon, as Mary was taking a break in the break room, Sarah, one of the junior managers who had been vocal in opposing the changes, approached her. Unlike the others, Sarah's approach wasn't hostile. There was something almost hesitant in her demeanor. "Mary, can I talk to you for a second?" she asked quietly. Mary glanced up, surprised. "Sure, Sarah. What's on your mind?" Sarah took a deep breath before sitting across from her. "I want to apologize. For how I acted before, the way I dismissed your ideas. I didn't understand. Honestly, I didn't think the changes would amount to anything. But I see now that I was wrong. I've been talking to some of the employees, and the atmosphere has shifted. People feel like they can finally speak up. It's not perfect, but it's a start." Mary was taken aback. Sarah had always been a part of the old guard, someone who seemed more concerned with keeping the peace than making waves. The fact that she was admitting to her mistake was significant. "I appreciate that, Sarah," Mary replied, her voice soft but resolute. "It's not going to be easy, but we can make a difference. We just have to keep pushing." Over the next few weeks, Mary found herself in conversations with more and more employees. The quiet revolution that had begun with a single speech was slowly gathering momentum. People who had once been invisible were now standing up, demanding respect and equality. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt. At times, it felt as though the weight of the fight was too much for any one person to bear. But Mary, more than anyone, knew that there was no turning back. And then, just as things seemed to be progressing, the corporate board called a meeting. Mr. Thompson was summoned, and Mary was asked to attend as well. The email came as a shock, especially after everything that had transpired in the previous months. The subject line read, "Important Company Review, Please Attend." The uncertainty in the air was thick, and Mary knew that this was the moment that would determine the course of everything she had fought for. When the meeting day arrived, Mary found herself seated across from the board members. Mr. Thompson, his face solemn, sat beside her. The room was cold, the atmosphere charged with an uncomfortable tension. No one spoke at first. They all waited for the chairman to address the room. He was a tall man, his presence imposing, and when he finally began to speak, his tone was both calm and decisive. "We've gathered here today to discuss the future of this company. As you all know, recent changes have been made. Some of these changes have been well received, while others have raised concerns among the staff. There have been disruptions to the workplace culture. Some of these disruptions are welcome, but others have caused friction within the ranks. We are here today to assess whether or not these changes align with our long-term vision." Mary's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what this was. It was the moment and the board would decide whether to undo everything that had been started. She glanced over at Mr. Thompson, who was visibly tense but holding his ground. He had fought for these changes, and now it was his turn to defend them. "The board understands that some individuals have found the changes challenging," the chairman continued. "But we must remember that this company has always prided itself on its dedication to excellence, efficiency, and stability. Any initiative that threatens these principles will be scrutinized." The silence in the room was deafening as Mary took a deep breath. It was clear now that the board was not in favor of the changes. They wanted to maintain control, to preserve the status quo. The conversation turned into a debate about risk management, about the importance of tradition, and whether the company's core values could withstand such upheaval. Just as the discussion reached its peak, Mary stood up, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "If you truly believe in the principles of excellence and efficiency, then you need to understand that innovation, respect, and inclusion are not threats. They are the future. We cannot keep living in a world where only a select few have the power to make decisions. The real risk is not changing, it's staying stagnant. This company will never thrive if it continues to ignore the voices of its employees." Her words rang out, clear and unwavering. For a moment, everything went still. The room was silent as the board members exchanged glances. It wasn't the speech she had planned, it was raw, it was real, and it was everything she had been fighting for. Then, Mr. Thompson stood beside her, his voice firm and filled with conviction. "I stand with Mary," he said simply. "And I will continue to stand with her. This is the direction we're going. The changes may be difficult, but they are necessary for the company's growth. It's time for us to truly embrace the future." The room remained quiet, but there was something in the air, something that had shifted once again. The battle wasn't over. But Mary had made her stand, and for the first time, it felt like the tides were finally beginning to turn. The fight for respect, for equality, for change, it was no longer just her fight. It was everyone's.